He didn't shake her hand. Not when she walked into the boardroom that Tuesday morning. Not when she set her files on the table. Not when she introduced herself to the 3 other partners already seated. Dominic Hargrove looked at Celine Beaumont Walsh the way men look at furniture they've already decided to replace. Briefly, dismissively, then away. She noticed. She always noticed. But she sat down, opened her folder, and said nothing. That was 11 years ago. Back then, Celine had been 32, freshly promoted to Senior Acquisitions Manager at Hargrove Development, and quietly certain that the man who'd just ignored her handshake would either be her greatest professional obstacle or her greatest teacher. She hadn't imagined he'd become her husband. She certainly hadn't imagined this. Sitting in a hospital bed in the maternity ward at St. Michael's in Toronto, her daughter sleeping in a bassinet 3 feet away, while Dominic stood at the door holding a manila envelope and looking at her like she was a problem he was finally ready to solve. "You're serious," Celine said. Her voice was flat. She hadn't slept in 31 hours. "The timing isn't ideal," Dominic said. He had the audacity to sound reasonable. "But we both know this has been coming." Beside him, near the doorframe but clearly not willing to be invisible, stood Cassandra. 26 years old, dark hair, the kind of smile that practiced itself in mirrors. She was wearing a camel coat and holding a coffee cup that had her name on it, as though she'd stopped for a latte on the way to watch Celine's marriage end. She just arrived 4 hours ago. The nurse at the station had told Dominic when he'd asked about Celine's status. The nurse had looked confused when Cassandra walked in behind him. Celine looked at the envelope. She looked at her daughter, 6 pounds, 4 ounces, born at 3:14 in the morning, perfect in every way that mattered. Then she looked back at her husband of 8 years. "Leave," she said. "Celine, you brought her here." Her voice didn't crack. She'd decided, somewhere around hour 22 of labor, that she was done cracking around Dominic Hargrove. "You brought her to this room. You can both leave, or I will call security and they will remove you, and you will have the pleasure of explaining to the nurses why you thought this was appropriate." Dominic stepped forward and set the envelope on the edge of her bed. "My lawyer needs those back by Friday," he said. He left. Cassandra followed, clicking down the hallway in heeled boots that weren't made for hospital floors. The nurse, who came in 20 minutes later to check on Celine's vitals, didn't say anything about what she'd witnessed. She just checked the monitors, wrote something down, and asked if Celine needed more water. Celine said yes. The nurse brought it and then stood there for a moment. "Your daughter has really good lungs," she said. Celine looked at the bassinet. "She does. Fighters usually do." The nurse left and Celine picked up the envelope and held it. She didn't open it. She already knew what was inside. She'd been watching Dominic maneuver toward this moment for 8 months. Slow and careful the way he was careful about everything except the things that mattered. She'd watched him move accounts, restructure holding companies, quietly shift the board's understanding of who had brought what to Hargrove Development. She'd watched him the way you watch someone who doesn't know you're watching, which is to say, completely. What Dominic Hargrove did not know, had never known, because he'd stopped asking her questions about anything that wasn't dinner reservations, or wasn't dinner reservation, or whose turn it was to call the plumber, was that Celine had spent the last 3 years doing something very specific with the money she'd inherited from her grandmother in Montreal. Estelle Beaumont had died in the spring of Celine's 38th year, leaving behind a small house in Outremont, a collection of Quebecois art that nobody in the family had ever properly appraised, and a letter in a pale blue envelope addressed to Celine alone. The letter said 3 things: that Estelle had always known Celine was the only one in the family who understood what land was really worth, that there was a safety deposit box at a branch on Côte des Neiges, and that what was in that box belonged entirely to Celine, not to her marriage, not to her husband, not to anyone who had not earned it. The box had contained documents, deeds specifically, property in the Laurentians that Estelle had purchased quietly over 30 years, parcels of land outside of Tremblant, along the river, high ground with no mortgage and no liens, accumulated the way a woman who'd lived through 1 depression and 2 recessions learned to accumulate things. Without announcing it, without asking permission, without trusting that anyone else would think it was a good idea. Celine had sat with a real estate attorney named Priya Mehta in a quiet office on Peel Street and learned that her grandmother had left her approximately 900 acres of land. Not developed, not leveraged, just land, clean and whole, in her grandmother's name and now in hers. She hadn't told Dominic. She'd thought about it many times. In the early months, she'd nearly said something over dinner, had begun the sentence twice and swallowed it both times. Later, she understood why. Some part of her had known, even then, that the marriage was moving toward something she couldn't see clearly yet. Some part of her had listened to the way Dominic talked about her contributions at work. Celine handles the relationship side of things. I handle the strategy, and understood that in his accounting of their shared life, she had always been an asset he managed rather than a person he loved. She left the hospital on a Thursday with her daughter, whom she named Odette, after no one in particular, just because it was a name that felt like its own person, and went to her sister's house in Leaside because she wasn't going back to the house in Forest Hill while Dominic was in it. Her sister, who had opinions about Dominic that she'd been storing up for years with the patience of a very organized person, made tea and did not say "I told you so," which was the most loving thing she'd ever done. The divorce papers stayed in the envelope for 11 days. On the 12th day, Celine called Priya Mehta. What Celine knew about Dominic's plan was this. He intended to argue that Hargrove Development, the company they had technically co-founded, though the story of that co-founding had been quietly revised over the years to feature him more prominently, was his, built on his capital, his vision, his contacts. He would point to the fact that his name was on the original incorporation documents, that the flagship office was on Bay Street, in a building his father had owned, that the early press coverage had always photographed him, and rarely her. He would bring in a forensic accountant. He would be organized and calm, and absolutely certain that the story he was telling was the true one. What Dominic did not know was that Celine had kept everything. Not in any dramatic way. Not a hidden filing cabinet, or a fireproof safe with a combination nobody else had. She'd kept things the way capable people keep things, methodically, as a matter of habit, because she'd grown up watching her grandmother keep things, and had understood from a young age that documents were the only kind of memory that held up in a room full of lawyers. She had the original pitch deck she'd built in 2015 for the Rosedale acquisition. The one that had convinced their first major institutional investor to write a check for $3 million. She had the emails from that period, dozens of them, showing that while Dominic had been in Whistler for a long weekend, she had been on the phone with the city's zoning office at 9 p.m. on a Friday. She had the investor's reply, which said specifically, "I'm in because of the woman who answered every question I had at 11 at night. Whatever she's building, I want in." She had the contracts she'd negotiated, the partnership agreements she'd drafted and redrafted, the notes from the board meetings she'd run while Dominic was traveling. She also had 900 acres in the Laurentians. The reason the land mattered, the reason it mattered so specifically that Priya had let out a slow breath when Celine had explained the full picture, was that 2 years ago, Hargrove Development had begun quietly assembling a proposal for a resort development in the Laurentian region. It was Dominic's pet project, the thing he talked about at dinner parties, as though it were already finished. As though the sketches the architect had drawn were already steel and glass. He'd been acquiring parcels, dealing with landowners, working through intermediaries. It was going to be, he said, the thing that put Hargrove Development on a national stage. He had not known when he began that the central parcel, the acreage along the river that made the whole project viable, the land without which the access roads didn't work and the sightlines didn't sell and the proposal fell apart, belonged to Celine. He still didn't know. Priya had looked at the deeds and the development proposal and the survey maps for a long time. Then she'd said, "He's been negotiating with a third-party land agent for that parcel for 14 months. "I know," Celine said. "The land agent has been telling him the owner won't sell. The land agent works for me." Priya had taken off her glasses. "You've known about the resort project the entire time, since the first dinner party where he described it in detail to people who had no idea I was the one who would eventually need to sign off on it," Celine said. "Yes." There was a pause. "You didn't tell him. He stopped asking me things," Celine said simply. "I stopped volunteering them." The custody conversation was harder than the property conversation. That was always true, Priya told her. Money moved according to documents, but a child moved according to arguments about character and stability and intention. And those arguments had a way of getting ugly before they got resolved. Dominic's lawyer, a man named Sutherland, who wore cufflinks and had a reputation for being very effective and very expensive, filed an initial motion that suggested Celine had been emotionally unavailable during the marriage due to professional obligations. It was the kind of language that sounded neutral and was in fact a specific kind of attack, one designed to make a working woman seem like a negligent mother before her child was 8 weeks old. Celine read it twice and handed it back to Priya without expression. "How do you want to respond?" Priya asked. "I want to respond to everything," Celine said. "But start with the property." When Priya's office sent a formal notice to Sutherland's office, informing them that the central parcel of the Laurentian resort development was titled in the name of Celine Beaumont Walsh, personal property, inherited, predating the marriage, exempt from matrimonial division. There was a silence of approximately 4 days before anyone on Dominic's side said anything. Celine spent those 4 days at her sister's house in Leaside. She fed Odette at 2 in the morning and 4 in the morning and 6:30 in the morning. She drank too much coffee and not enough water. She watched the leaves starting to come in on the maple in her sister's backyard and thought about her grandmother, about Estelle in her house in Outremont, about the way the old woman had moved through rooms, like she knew exactly how much space she was entitled to occupy. On the 5th day, Sutherland's office called Priya's office and asked for a meeting. Dominic arrived at the mediation office on a Wednesday looking composed and wearing the jacket that Celine had always known was his armor, charcoal, well cut, the one he wore when he needed to feel like himself. She noticed it the way she'd noticed everything about him for 11 years, precisely, and without letting him see. He sat down across from her, and for the first time since the hospital room, he really looked at her. "You could have told me," he said. His voice was quiet, the way it got when he was genuinely thrown. "You could have asked," she said. His lawyer placed a hand on his arm. The mediation took 2 sessions. By the end of the 2nd session, it had been agreed that the Laurentian parcel was not part of the matrimonial assets, that the resort development as currently proposed was not viable without Celine's cooperation or her sale of the land, that Celine retained a significant stake in Hargrove development based on documented contributions that had been placed before the mediator in a binder that was approximately 400 pages long. The custody arrangement was shared. Odette would spend time with both parents. Dominic's lawyer had quietly dropped the language about emotional unavailability. Somewhere between the 1st and 2nd session, after Priya had submitted a supplementary document containing, among other things, 37 emails sent between midnight and 5 a.m., showing Celine managing company communications while simultaneously on a call with a client in Vancouver. The note Priya attached to that document said only, "Evidence of professional commitment is available in abundance. Evidence of emotional unavailability is not." Celine signed the final divorce decree on a Friday morning in April. It was raining, which felt appropriate to her. Not dramatic. Just the kind of gray, persistent rain that Toronto does in spring. The kind that doesn't ask permission and doesn't apologize and eventually makes everything grow. She went back to her apartment. She'd moved out of the Leaside house into her own place in the annex. A building with a tiny balcony that got afternoon light. And she made lunch and put Odette down for a nap and sat at the kitchen table for a while doing nothing. She thought about the boardroom 11 years ago. The handshake Dominic hadn't taken. The way she'd sat down anyway, opened her folder, said nothing. She'd spent a long time saying nothing in the right places and everything in the right documents. In June, Priya called with an update on the Laurentian situation. Dominic's development team had pivoted, or tried to. They'd commissioned a new survey looking for alternative access routes, alternative parcels, some way to make the resort viable without the river acreage. The survey had come back with bad news. The topography didn't cooperate. The project, as designed, needed what Celine had, Dominic's new CEO. He'd brought in someone from outside to run operations, a sign the board had lost some confidence, though nobody said so publicly, had reached out through a different intermediary, asking whether Celine would be interested in a partnership structure for the development. Not a sale, a partnership. Priya had asked Celine what she wanted to do. Celine had looked out the window at her balcony, at the afternoon light. She'd thought about the way her grandmother had moved through rooms, the way Estelle had bought land quietly, parcel by parcel, over 3 decades, without announcing it, without asking permission. "Tell them I'll review the proposal," she said, "and tell them I'll be bringing my own legal team and my own architect, and that the project name changes." "Changes to what?" Priya asked. Celine thought for a moment. "Beaumont," she said. "The development is called Beaumont." There was a brief pause on the line. "Done," Priya said. Cassandra, it turned out, had lasted 4 months. Celine learned this not through any dramatic scene, but through a mutual acquaintance who mentioned it the way people mention weather, briefly, as context. Dominic had apparently moved back into the Forest Hill house alone, which he rattled around in at weekends when he didn't have Odette. Nobody said anything about whether he was happy. Nobody really needed to. Celine didn't spend much time thinking about it. She was busy in the specific way she liked being busy, doing things that were hers, that she'd built, that had her grandmother's land underneath them. On a Saturday in late August, she drove up to the Laurentians with Odette in the back seat, and a thermos of coffee in the cup holder, and Priya's latest briefing notes on the passenger seat. She parked near the river access point and got out and stood there in the early morning light, with Odette in a carrier against her chest, looking at the land. 900 acres, trees and water and high ground. Her grandmother's patience converted into soil and deed and possibility. Odette made a small sound against her collarbone, not distress, just the sound babies make when they're awake and paying attention to the world. "I know," Celine said quietly. "It's a lot to take in." She stood there for a while, letting the morning be what it was. Somewhere behind her, a car passed on the highway, the sound fading into the trees. In front of her, the river moved the way it always had, without asking, without waiting, just heading steadily in the direction it had always been going. She thought there was something in that worth holding on to. She put the thermos back in the car and took out her phone and called Priya, because the architect was coming at noon, and there were decisions to make, and Celine Beaumont Walsh had never been someone who made people wait.